In May 1983, Diane Downs shot her 3 children before shooting herself in the arm to stage being attacked by a carjacker, but her plot failed when 2 of her children survived. Diane Downs had what most would consider an idyllic lifestyle. She married the love of her life, her high school sweetheart, worked part-time, and had 3 wonderful children, Christy, Cheryl, and Danny. Unfortunately, in 1980, her husband Stephen Downs divorced her after being convinced their baby boy, Danny, was actually not his. 3 years after the divorce, Diane started seeing a man named Robert Knickerbocker, a married man. However, he didn't want to be with her because she had children. He said, quote, "I don't want to be a daddy." Things would take a far worse turn for Diane, or most would feel that way at least. On May 19, 1983, Diane rushed her children to Springfield, Oregon Hospital. The story she was about to tell was one of horror. Sadly, the hospital employees quickly determined that Cheryl was already dead, and that Christy and Danny were clinging to life. Cheryl had only been 7 years old. Unfortunately for Diane, she didn't leave unscathed. She had been shot in her left forearm, though her wound was not life-threatening. Diane told a strange story of a bushy-haired stranger that had flagged her down in a dark, deserted country road. Detective Doug Walsh interviewed Diane, and this is what he said. He said, quote, "Her initial statement was that she had taken the kids out to a friend's house, and it grew dark, and upon their return home, she decided to do some sightseeing. And she took a deserted country road with 3 sleeping kids in the car. And along this road off to the side, outstepped a man who flagged her down. She stopped the car and asked him what he wanted, and his response was, 'I want your car.' She replied, 'You've got to be kidding,' and at which time he pushed her aside and reached in and shot the sleeping kids." Diane said she faked throwing her keys to divert the gunman's attention, pushed him out of the way, jumped back in the car, and raced to the hospital with her children. She says it was during the struggle with the man that she was shot in the arm. The police immediately released information to the public about the killer on the loose and provided the public with a sketch. Now, this is my personal opinion, but it looks like Diane sketched herself unknowingly, or maybe knowingly, since she is a narcissist. But anyway, Detective Walsh said that there were a number of things that didn't make sense even that first night. Quote, "Sightseeing when it's pitch black out, and why are the kids fatally or near fatally wounded, and she being right-handed is shot in the left arm? I mean, think about it. She's the biggest threat to him, not 3 sleeping children." Other red flags began popping up. Diane's wound had been meticulously bandaged when she arrived at the hospital, but her right arm was remarkably clean considering the amount of blood inside the car. Also, staff at the hospital thought it was strange that Diane wasn't showing concern for her children. She was intent on getting in touch with her boyfriend and was not bothered by the fact that 1 of her children were dead and 2 were in critical condition. When doctors informed her that the bullet hit Danny's spine and paralyzed him, she said she was surprised it didn't hit his heart. She also said things like, quote, "Boy, this has really spoiled my vacation. And that really ruined my new car. I got blood all over the back of it." 4 days after the accident, Diane does a reenactment of May 19, which was the day of the attack, and, well, she seemed more than happy to do so.
Do a reenactment for us. We simply wanted to nail down her statements, and she was more than happy to do that.
Sitting in the car is Elizabeth Diane Downs.
She can be seen sitting in the car, and she's kind of primping, making sure that her hair looked the way she wanted it.
Diane Downs is trying to show the investigators exactly what happens.
I'm throwing the keys, okay? I'm throwing the keys.
So they can understand and get the forensics right.
I go like that. I got in the car, jumped in, put the keys in. I just hit my cast. Started the car and left. The car door shut itself. God.
She was giddy.
As you can see, Diane primped her hair and makeup in the mirror before her big act, and if you didn't catch what she said at the end, she laughed as she bumped her cast, saying it almost hurt more than when it happened. It's the fact that she's laughing at an incident that caused her daughter's death. At first, the public sympathized with Diane, but it's her performance and lack of emotions that angered the public. Unfortunately, police didn't have much evidence. Danny was asleep when it happened, and Christy has suffered a stroke and couldn't speak. Nurses reported that when Diane would come into Christy's room, the girl's vital signs would spike as though she was afraid. At one point, Diane told Surgeon Stephen Wilhite to, quote, pull the plug, since she knew Christy was brain dead, but there were no evidence of that, and they refused to take Christy off life support. Police were looking closer into her story. They found a .22 caliber casing at the crime scene, but no weapon. While Diane had denied owning a gun, both exes said she owned a .22 Ruger pistol. Records actually showed that she had, in fact, purchased a .22 caliber pistol in Arizona. Upon searching her house, they also found a .22 caliber bullet that matched those found at the crime scene, but no weapon. Meanwhile, Diane was still being interviewed. If you haven't caught on yet, Diane loves to talk.
A lot of people, when something traumatic happens to them, they suppress it immediately. I kept those memories because I knew that I was the only person that was going to be able to tell them what happened when we got to the hospital. And when I got there, the first thing I said was call the doctors. Second thing was the blood type. Third thing was call the cops because they've got to find him. And so I had to remember as much as I could remember. When this man shot my daughter, my first reaction was to snap back to my childhood, to the pain that had happened to me back then, my marriage, my entrapment by society. This man was bigger than me. He was stronger than me. He had more power because he had a gun. He was in control and I was not. And there was nothing I could do. And I stood there and I looked at Christy reaching, and the blood that just kept gushing out of her mouth, what do? You just stand there trapped. And then the gun kept firing and firing and firing, and it was monotonous. It just kept going. It was like a slow motion picture. And then he swung around towards me, and this is something that I did not recall when I was explaining to the cops, because it wasn't like a movie when I was telling them. I was telling them what happened, the important details. He shot my kids, I pushed him, I ran. And when he swung around, he was pointing, when he swung around, it hit the tips of my fingers. The gun hit the tips of my fingers, and that snapped me. And I went, wait a minute. I'm not trapped by society. I don't care if he is bigger. If I stand here and I say, yeah, here, take the keys. I mean, there's nothing I can do. You win because you have the gun. My kids are going to die. And I'm not going to let my kids die. And so instead of giving him the keys, I feigned throwing the keys. He did not take time to point the gun and shoot me, obviously, because he would have shot me the same way he did the kids. When he was swinging in the direction of the keys, firing the gun, he hit my arm. Everybody says, you sure were lucky. Well, I don't feel very lucky. I couldn't tie my damn shoes for about 2 months. It is very painful. It is still painful. I have a steel plate on my arm. I will for 1.5 years. The scar is going to be there forever. I'm going to remember that night for the rest of my life, whether I want to or not. I don't think I was very lucky. I think my kids were lucky. If I had been shot the way they were, we all would have died. Except maybe Danny.
What haunts you the most about that night?
What do I see most is blood coming out of Christy's mouth, because that's what I see. I can't see Danny, and I can't see Cher. Sherry was laying on the floor, and driving to the hospital, I don't know the sounds that were made at the initial shooting because I was on the outside, and all I could hear, I can't hear anything but gunshots. And I can see things, you know, that's it. Driving to the hospital, I can smell blood. I can not hear Cheryl. Cheryl's not making a sound. Danny is just crying real soft. So that sound stays in my mind, and the fact that Christy's choking, and then I'm yelling at her and screaming at her to roll over on her face, because I was trying to keep her from choking on her blood, and it just didn't dawn on me that she was shot in the chest and that the blood was coming from her chest, not going down into her chest.
How are your children the lucky ones when one is dead and the other suffered a stroke from immense blood loss and your son is forever paralyzed? I have so many questions, like why she ever pulled over for a crazy looking dude in the middle of nowhere, and then also why were you sightseeing at night? what is there to see at night? A witness that was following behind her said that Diane was driving very slowly to get to the hospital. Now, this could be because her arm was injured, but I think we can all assume why she was driving slowly. Turns out, after some digging, investigators found that Diane had always been troubled. She was born Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson on August 7, 1955 in Phoenix, Arizona. As a teenager, she rebelled against her parents' conservative Baptist upbringing. At 14, she got into a relationship with 16-year-old Stephen Downs, who lived across the street from her. After high school, Stephen joined the Navy and Diane attended Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College, but she was expelled for promiscuity only a year into college. Diane then went to live with her parents but continued her relationship with Stephen, and on November 1973, when he came home from the Navy, Diane ran away from home to elope. Their relationship was rocky from the very beginning, and Stephen always suspected she was cheating. However, they stayed together, and in 1974, they had their first child. According to Stephen, she was the, quote, only woman I know who gets pregnant to cheer herself up. It seemed that she enjoyed her pregnancy, but she didn't enjoy actually raising the children. As Stephen said, quote, she treated the kids like crap. After their second child, Stephen decided he didn't want children and got a vasectomy because he didn't trust Diane. She still got pregnant, however, but terminated that pregnancy. In 1978, Diane moved to Mesa, Arizona and had numerous affairs with coworkers and became pregnant with Danny. Stephen knew he wasn't his father, but cared for the child regardless. But less than a year later, he divorced Diane. Later on, Diane tried to become a surrogate mother in order to make money, but failed 2 separate psychiatric exams, one of which indicated she was psychotic. She found this extremely funny and would often brag to friends about it. I'm not sure how Diane did it, but she eventually became a surrogate in 1981 and received $10,000. Thankfully, she handed the baby back to the parents, and, well, that would have taken a different turn. Earlier that year, she got a job as a postal worker and left her children with her parents, but neighbors were concerned for the children as the children often begged for food and they didn't have weather-appropriate clothes. 6-year-old Christy was often babysitting for her siblings if Diane couldn't find anyone else. Finally, police arrested Diane February 28, 1984. She was charged with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Her trial began that May. Shocking yet not surprising, she arrived to court pregnant. She explained to a reporter that she became pregnant because, quote, I missed Christy and I miss Danny and I miss Cheryl so much. She went on, you can't replace children, but you can replace the effect they give you, and children are so easy to conceive. She says something similar to Oprah as well.
Why did you get pregnant again?
I was extremely lonely. I missed my kids desperately. I had just seen Christy on the 2nd of October, and it's like opening a wound and pouring salt in. I was extremely lonely, beyond belief and beyond explanation. And on October 13th, I just went and got pregnant because I was so lonely. I love my children. I miss my children. And I know that sounds simplistic. It really does. And I have to admit that. And that's why I say there's so much more feeling inside than I can give in 2 minutes.
My whole life, even as a child, all I really thought about, I used to carry dolls around on a pillow, and I wanted to be a mom.
I believe the real reason Diane got pregnant was to show the public how innocent she is and how much of a loving mother she was. Now, Diane eventually gave birth to a baby girl who was adopted immediately. She herself has an interesting story, so if you're interested in reading about that, you can find that online. Moving on to the trial. Diane's own actions showed how remorseless she was. Prosecutors played Hungry Like a Wolf, the very song played during the shooting, and Diane couldn't help but bob her head and tap her feet. Now let's talk about Diane's motives. I think it's clear she wanted nothing to do with her children because the man she loved and didn't love her back, a married man, didn't want to play daddy to her children. Diane seemed to believe that if she got rid of her children, that this man would fall in love with her and leave his wife for her. I mean, she's obviously delusional. In her diaries, she had written extensively about her obsession with Knickerbocker. Diane had pressured him to leave his wife for her, but Knickerbocker had refused. Knickerbocker later reported that Diane had stalked him and threatened to kill his wife so she could have him to herself.
2 years' time, I had 10 separate lovers. 2 years. That's not very many, and less than half of them were married.
According to police, she became obsessed with trying to get him, writing him letters every day, but they would come back unopened.
He would change his mind on a daily basis. I'm coming, I'm going, I'm coming, I'm going. I want a divorce, I've changed my mind, I don't want a divorce. A week and a half later, he changes his mind, he doesn't want a divorce.
How unlucky for Diane, her star witness was her very own daughter, Christy Downs. The brave young girl had been recovering physically and mentally for her to take the stand. The very question was, who shot her? Her response was, my mom. In June, Diane was found guilty of all 3 counts and sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years in Oregon Women's Correctional Center. On July 11, 1987, just 3 years into her sentence, Diane scaled a 15-foot-high chain-link fence. There were no guards in the lookout tower, and a motion sensor on the fence triggered an alarm, but by the time the guards arrived, Diane had already disappeared. She made it to one of her inmates' estranged husband's home, and she asked if she could stay, and he was more than happy to let her because he claims that he fell in love with her. He received 5 years probation and 6 months in restitution. Luckily, cops were able to track her down when they found a note in her cell. She had drawn a map and circled her location. They located her after 10 days and she received an additional 5 years. Danny and Christy were adopted by the prosecution attorney. They live a happy and private life, and Diane will rot in jail. I'm going to add a video here that gives me the creeps before I end this video, and it looks like Diane is speaking to a reporter, and at the end she gives a smile, almost like a haha, I fooled you all. Creeps me out.
The thing that really haunts me the most is not even the sight and the sound. I mean, the sound and the smell are fading. But at night, when I close my eyes, I can see Christy reaching her hand out to me while I'm driving, and the blood just keep coming out of her mouth. And that, maybe it'll fade too with time, but I don't think so. That haunts me the most.
Thank you all so much for watching. If you can be so kind to like this video, I would really appreciate it. It helps my small little YouTube channel out so much. For now, take care and stay safe, and see you later.